Just open my PowerPoint.
There we go. Thank you for joining our presentation this evening. We are very, very glad indeed that Professor Ken Dark is going to speak to us. He's done tremendous work in Nazareth, and one of my favorite books at the moment is his book, Archaeology of Jesus' Nazareth, and that's the topic of his presentation this evening. If you want to ask questions or raise points, then please put them in the chat, and we'll collect some of those up at the end of the event. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Ken and really enjoy what he has to say to us. Over to you, Professor Ken.
Thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk about the archaeology of Jesus' Nazareth. And that introduction gives away the fact that most of what I'm saying, if not all of what I'm saying, will be in my recent book, Archaeology of Jesus' Nazareth, which is published by Oxford University Press. And that's, although it's published by University Press, it's a book intending to make the work I've done in and around Nazareth accessible to people who aren't archaeologists, who have perhaps no previous knowledge of archaeology or of the region, and just want to know about first century Nazareth, or about the context in which Jesus grew up there and was a young man there. So with no further ado, I shall begin the lecture. Nazareth in Galilee, or some people say the Galilee, in what's today northern Israel, is a modern town, modern city of tens of thousands of people. It's densely populated, and its population is these days largely comprised of Christian and Muslim Israeli citizens, and a smaller amount, a lesser amount of Israeli Jews. And the city of Nazareth is characterized today by being really a major population hub in the Galilee region, which is one of the most fertile, most temperate regions of Israel. It's even today agriculturally very productive, and it's got quite a lot of hilly territory and quite a lot of agricultural fields within it. And these two characteristics are going to play some part in what I'm about to say about first century Nazareth. Nazareth isn't much mentioned in the Gospels, at least so far as a description of the actual physical place called Nazareth. There are mentions of Jesus being Jesus of Nazareth, or coming from Nazareth, but the most detailed description of Nazareth as a place is in the Gospel of Luke, Luke 4, and particularly Luke 4, 16 and 29. And you can see those brief passages on the screen now. So 16 says, when he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. So what Luke is trying to tell us there seems to be that there was a synagogue, whatever that was, in Nazareth at the time Jesus was an adult there. And in 29, they got up, drove him out of town, that is the people, or some of the people of Nazareth, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. Now, this seems to be saying that Nazareth was in some sense on a hill. It doesn't really say whether it was on the top of a hill or built up the slopes of a hill or both, but in some sense on a hill, and that the hill was sufficiently steep that somebody might be harmed by hurling them off the side. And there's this use of the Greek word polis, which is translated here as town, which has caused a great amount of confusion about what sort of place first century Nazareth is. Well, not getting into it in detail here, polis, though in classical Greek it means a town, even a city, can mean just a settlement, a place people lived in the Greek of the first century and in the Greek of the early Roman period. We see this in other writings of the time. We see this in other Roman period Greek writings. So the Gospel of Luke is really saying that Nazareth was a settlement somehow on the top of a hill or on the slopes or both of a hill, which was a quite steep hill, at least in part, and there was what Luke calls a synagogue on that in that settlement, and Jesus attended the synagogue, and Jesus had grown up in the town, as is conventionally translated, of Nazareth. But that really doesn't get us very far. If polis can just mean a settlement, and synagogue in the first century is a very debatable term. It might just mean an assembly of people. It might mean a building. It might mean both. We really don't know what Luke was referring to here. And so far as the hill is concerned, well, Galilee is full of hills. There are lots of hills which have sufficiently steep parts, which one might hurl somebody off to harm them. So this really isn't telling us much about Nazareth at all. And in fact, if I can get my PowerPoint to go down, which it's not, which it is now doing, we find very little outside the Gospels in textual references to Nazareth. Yes, Nazareth is attested as being there later in the Roman period, in the Byzantine period, and in the post-Byzantine period. But across the first, but across the first millennium, there are very sporadic and rare references to Nazareth in textual sources. So, for example, though Nazareth is referred to as a pilgrim center by Ageria in the 380s, and again in the 460s as the seat of a bishop dependent on the more important bishop of Beth Shan which is seen as a ruin in this slide, though it's mentioned on those two occasions, it isn't mentioned in the interim at all. In other words, we have a period of decades, almost a century, in which Nazareth, although it's plainly there, plainly a Christian pilgrim centre, isn't mentioned by texts. And this pattern of, we know Nazareth was there, but it's hardly mentioned at all for decades on end, repeats itself throughout the first millennium. So, claiming that we have very few texts for first century Nazareth, other than the Gospels, if any, as a source for disputing the existence of Nazareth in the first century is an illogical argument. If so, we'd have to dispute the existence of Nazareth at a time when we know that it was a major Christian centre, a centre with a bishop, no less. And in the Byzantine Empire, the Christian Eastern Roman Empire of the late 5th and 6th centuries, having a bishop meant a place was truly on the map. It was usually an urban place. Yet, after the Bishop of Nazareth being mentioned in the late 5th century, he isn't mentioned again. So we have no reason at all to doubt that Nazareth is there when it is not attested for decades, maybe even a century or more, by written sources. And that's an important point, because what we find is that if we're going to discover more about first century Nazareth, or for that matter, 5th or 6th century Nazareth, it's going to have to be through archaeology. And one would assume, especially given that, and given the great fame of Nazareth worldwide, if only through the expression Jesus of Nazareth, that archaeologists would have swarmed to Nazareth over the last century or so that archaeology has been in its modern form, and that we would have a pile of archaeological material from Nazareth, from multiple excavations and archaeological surveys conducted from the late 19th century onwards and throughout the 20th century. But that isn't the case. Archaeologists have largely neglected Nazareth. It's not that there isn't potentially the archaeological evidence there, it's that archaeologists haven't been trying to find it. True, when the Church of the Annunciation, seen on the left of this slide, the large church, sometimes mistaken for a cathedral, in the centre of Nazareth today, was built, or rather rebuilt, in the 1960s especially, into its present form. A series of rescue excavations, excavations ahead of construction work, were undertaken by the Franciscan biblical archaeologist Bellarmino Bagatti on the site where the new building would be. And he found a complex series of archaeological features, some of which, correctly in my opinion, he dated to the 1st century. including a series of rock-cut hollows, artificial caves, and agricultural processing installations. An example of which, a rock-cut cave, can be seen on the right of this slide. Now, if we want to learn more of first century Nazareth than comes from the one or two modern excavations which have been conducted in the centre of the city of Nazareth as it stands today in the 20th century, we have to go back and look at the archaeology of Nazareth again. And with any archaeological study, a starting point always has to be the natural landscape and the physical topography. Now, today, it's very hard to imagine in the centre of Nazareth what was, until the middle of the 19th century, the dominating feature of the whole of the city of Nazareth, and that is a steep-sided seasonal river called in English a wadi, more correctly pronounced a wadi, W-A-D-I, which characterized the absolute heart of what was later central Nazareth. And here you see an 1830s painting. It seems to be quite accurate, by a British artist called Roberts, depicting the wadi with bridges across it and the then Church of the Annunciation to the top of the right of this picture, and what was then the principal mosque in Nazareth, seen toward the center of the top of this picture, with its minaret very prominently shown. So in this depiction of 19th century Nazareth, we can see buildings constructed around the wadi on the hillsides of what is a very hilly site. But still, archaeological work had, by the end of the 20th century, been limited really to those few excavations which I mentioned earlier on, and very little consideration of both the broader settlement of Roman period and Byzantine, for that matter, Nazareth, and the context, the landscape context in which Nazareth in the first century onward existed. And on the screen here, you see the valley that separates Nazareth from the Roman town of Sepphoris, about 5 miles to its north. And the Roman town of Sepphoris was, from the 2nd century onwards, really a classic provincial Roman town with all the facilities, theatre, public buildings, a temple, paved streets, shops, grand houses with mosaics that term implies. It was quite different in the 1st century, but that's another story. Because the landscape falls sharply to the south of what is now central Nazareth, The agricultural land of the ancient settlement of Nazareth was almost certainly in this valley between Nazareth and Sepphoris. So when my own archaeological work in and around Nazareth began in 2004, we began by surveying, in archaeological terms, the valley between Sepphoris and Nazareth. And that had really not been done in a modern archaeological way ever before. At least, if it had been, it's not published anywhere, not known to scholarship. What we found was the landscape was dotted with previously undiscovered Roman period, and for that matter Byzantine, settlements, revealed by scatters of pottery, such as the one on the left, and other broken objects turned up by the plough in modern agricultural fields in the valley. Where these settlements were, there weren't just a few of these broken pieces of ceramics, but hundreds. But between them, between these dense scatters, there were fields or areas either without similar pottery at all, or with a very, very thin spread of much more eroded or anyway piecemeal pottery and objects of the same types. And this pattern of concentration and a penumbra of much more degraded and sparsely scattered material is well known in the archaeology of the Roman provinces as indicating a settlement in which domestic waste was used as part of the way that the people who were farming the area fertilized their fields. And that domestic waste is represented to us today by these very thin scatters of similar pottery and other objects that we find on the settlement sites. This sort of method of recording pottery and other objects turned up by the plough, so-called field walking, because it's based on just that, walking systematically across ploughed fields, is a very long established archaeological survey technique in the Roman provinces. It has countless times been shown accurately to identify buried archaeological evidence of settlements, of farms, of villages in the Roman countryside. So methodologically, this is not in doubt. Alongside this scatter of settlement sites, we found evidence of quarrying, sometimes small scale, but frequently occurring. These quarry sites were sometimes, and indeed often, associated with settlements, indicated in the way that I've just described. And here on the right of the picture is an example of the sort of thing you see at the quarry sites, an unfinished block, the scale is in 10 centimeters, left in the natural rock where it has not been removed by the quarriers. Other blocks were plainly removed. We find the voids for them much more frequently, of course, than we find these unfinished blocks. And so a typical quarry site in the valley would look like this, and you can see where blocks have been removed and set where some have been cut out. Now, plotting all this evidence in the form of maps, of which two are seen in this slide, enables us to identify the pattern of settlement, and by dating the pottery and also the other objects found in field walking, we can identify shifts in the pattern of settlement over time. And this is what we see in the valley north of Nazareth, where Roman period settlement seems to start at the very start of the Roman period locally, which is roughly at the turn of the millennium, just before, and then continue till the time that we see Byzantine pottery go out of use, which maybe is in the 7th century locally, and maybe is a bit later in the 8th century, perhaps. But thereafter, we find the valley almost totally deserted until the end of the Middle Ages. But there's a fascinating pattern also in the material found in this way. It's shown, and although I think perhaps you can't see it very clearly at this scale, in the picture on the right. Settlements identified through field walking closer to Sepphoris have a conventional range of objects that you might expect to find in a Roman provincial context. Objects found which are produced locally, objects which are produced elsewhere and brought to presumably Sepphoris and then marketed out to the countryside. But south of that group of sites, roughly occupy half the valley and the half closest to Nazareth, this pattern stops entirely. We have evidence of settlements, but the objects found are, for the Roman period, only those which we know or strongly believe from evidence elsewhere were manufactured by and for Jewish communities. And so the obvious interpretation of this pattern is that people living closer to Sepphoris, although other evidence attests that they were probably themselves Jewish, were living in a way in accordance with provincial Roman norms, so to speak, in a way that would be typical of people in the Roman provinces. However, those closer to Nazareth were apparently rejecting, for some reason, we'll come to why that might have been later on, rejecting Roman provincial culture, or at least material culture, in favour of specifically Jewish manufactured objects. And the possible explanation, the likely explanation, I think, in this sort of Galilean Roman period context is that the purity regulations, the purity laws, if you like, observed closer to Nazareth in the southern half of the valley were much stricter than the observational conformity to those laws in the northern half of the valley. It doesn't mean to say that the northern half of the valley was occupied by a non-Jewish population, but more likely that it was occupied by a Jewish population with a more liberal attitude to the purity laws as were perceived at that time. In all the parts of the valley, the economy seems to have been agricultural, but just as there are two separate settlement clusters or settlement systems, archaeologists might call them, north and south of the valley, so too there were two separate clusters of quarry sites. Now, the one north of the valley, or in the north of the valley, can easily be explained by the needs of Sepharis for building stone, paving slabs, etc. That's expectable and completely ordinary. But what was Nazareth, which we have been accustomed to think of as a small settlement, doing with its own cluster of quarry sites? A cluster of quarry sites which is, yes, less than that around Sepharis, but still significant in Galilean terms. Now, there is a type of rural settlement, not urban, but not a small hamlet, attested elsewhere in the Roman Empire, called a quarry settlement. And that type of settlement is basically agricultural, but supplemented its income, so to speak, especially it's thought at low points in the agricultural year, by small-scale quarrying. And thus it had, in a sense, a dual economy, agriculture and quarrying. Now, this may very well be what the archaeological evidence, I'm not talking here about texts at all, the archaeological evidence indicates for Roman period, including 1st century Nazareth. Why I've got a Roman coin, this one from the Sisters of Nazareth site in central Nazareth, up on the screen, is a fascinating observation, if you like, about all the survey evidence, and indeed almost all of the excavation in the centre of Nazareth, is that Roman coinage seems to be absent for the early Roman period. So far as I know, there is only one early Roman coin from the International Marian Centre excavation in the centre of Nazareth. There are some earlier coins further out from the centre of Nazareth, but in central Nazareth and in the valley north of modern Nazareth, Roman coins seem to be absent in the early Roman period. They occur in the later Roman period. This is a late Roman coin. But it seems from the archaeological evidence alone that there is a very good argument that the economy of the Nazareth area, including Nazareth itself, in the early Roman period was either not coin using or had very little use for coinage, probably insufficient use for coinage to make us think that coins were used in daily commerce. So in other words, this was probably a non-monetary economy in the early Roman period, including in the 1st century. Now, as I've said, my work, I don't know what has happened here. Something seems to have popped up on my screen, or which I didn't cause. My work in central Nazareth was really not an initial part of the project that I started in 2004. And that was because in 2004, we were trying to investigate the late Roman and Byzantine development of Nazareth. It was really only a byproduct of that investigation that we were finding all this earlier material in the valley between Nazareth and Severis. What we were aiming to do was to trace the development of Nazareth as a Christian pilgrimage centre in the late Roman and Byzantine period, and indeed beyond. But having found so much material from earlier in the Roman period, and having found a significant shift in these patterns in the late Roman or Byzantine period, in which this division between the north and the south of the valley in terms of objects disappears. You get a much more standard range of types of object across the whole valley. It was obviously time to try to figure out what was going on in the centre of Nazareth throughout the Roman period and indeed in the Byzantine period. Now, my initial thought was that we would have to conduct a new excavation, and that was in many ways far from preferable and going to be not at all easy. And so I was trying to search for a suitable site at which to do this investigation, when I came across an unpublished but immensely rich already excavated site at the Sisters of Nazareth convent, absolutely in the centre of Nazareth, just opposite the Church of the Annunciation, where just opposite the Church of the Annunciation, where those earlier excavations had occurred in the 20th century. Here you see the Sisters of Nazareth convent on the left, and on the right, its small museum. It has a museum because when the convent was constructed in the 19th and very early 20th centuries, an amazing array of archaeological material dating from the Roman period onwards was discovered under what is today this thriving Catholic convent. These archaeological indications suggested a complex structural sequence involving a substantial Byzantine period, probably late 5th, 6th and 7th century building, evidenced by architectural fragments such as those seen here, and even a fragment of a Byzantine Greek inscription seen at the bottom left of this slide. Looking at records kept by the nuns of the convent from their own archaeological excavations in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, such as this plan, shown here as merely an illustration of a wide range of archaeological records preserved in the convent. It was clear that what the nuns had found was a large and very elaborately decorated Byzantine surface level church, extensively refurbished in the Crusader period. And in fact, in this part, on the right of this slide, you can see the apses of the church. Beneath this surface level Byzantine church, there was a cave church, very well preserved for a structure of its date, carved into the rock, not a natural cave, and datable to at least the 4th century onward. And here we see the steps up to the chancel of the cave church, and on the left there's a platform which supports a series of liturgical basins which seem to have been involved in the collection and dispersal of water. And one of the things an early Arab writer tells us about Christianity in Nazareth is that the Christians of the early post-Byzantine period, at least, collected and distributed water in a liturgical context, water that had drained out of the rock and which they considered in some way sanctified. Now, this cave church was destroyed by fire, as was the surface level building in its Crusader form, in some sort of context, possibly the siege of Nazareth in 1187, in which the whole complex was burnt down, and the burning layer contained this lamp, among many other objects, the lamp datable closely to the late 12th century, or just at the turn from the 12th to the 13th century. So that fits an 1187 destruction date really very well. Before the cave church, the site had been used for a Jewish cemetery. It's very difficult to date exactly the part of the cemetery that was later incorporated into the cave church, but it seems to have been in use in the 1st century. And the southern part, or the part outside the cave church, was more definitely of a 1st century form. This cave church had been modified out of one of the tombs of the earlier Roman cemetery, and was itself associated with the management of water from its entrance area, where there was a cistern accessed by this well-like structure, to the very chancel, as we've seen, of the cave church. Now, going south from the cave church area, another part of the site excavated by the nuns, and you see this part of the site partly on the left here, included a tomb of characteristically 1st century construction, which had later been incorporated into the Crusader church, at least, as a chapel. And the chapel was well preserved when the nuns found it at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. So well preserved, in fact, that liturgical objects still lay on this simple altar, and there were knights' spurs hung as votives on its walls in a medieval context. But earlier than these tombs, and I've got something just popped up. Yes, I don't know why that keeps happening. Now I've lost my screen.
Just click back on PowerPoint at the bottom. That's
okay,
fantastic.
Thank you. And apologies for these technical hitches, and nothing I can do about them. Earlier than the tombs themselves, you will recall, probably dating from the 1st century, there was small-scale quarrying at this end of the site, and earlier than that, a rock-cut structure seen in the base of this area, but more spectacularly at its northern end, where we see a doorway, 2 walls incorporating both rock cut and built elements, and on the far side of this wall facing you, a rock cut stairway up to the level apparently of a roof or upper story, supported by this overhang of rock left in place. Beyond the door, there was another rock-cut room, and all of this, bear in mind, later than quarrying, later itself than this 1st century tomb. Remarkably, part of the floor of this rock-cut structure remained, seen below the scale here, and that floor contained a piece of pottery which we know from elsewhere couldn't have been produced before the Roman period, but was produced in the Roman period. That is to say, in local terms, roughly the start of the era, the start of the first millennium. Now, simple archaeological logic dictates that if a structure is later than the turn of the first millennium AD, that is to say, if it's 1st century or later, but it is cut through by a tomb that's not later than about AD 100, that structure has to be 1st century. And even more so when there's an intervening phase of small scale quarrying, cutting the structure, but preceding the 1st century tomb. The structure itself was associated in spatial and to some extent stratigraphical terms, that is to say, in terms of the layers and in terms of things found in the same area, with Roman period domestic material consistent with that 1st century date. Pottery, fragments of limestone vessels, and at least one, possibly two, spindle whorls, objects involved in spinning wool or other yarn. The structure itself associated with this domestic evidence shows some similarities, quite a lot of similarities, with domestic buildings elsewhere in Galilee, but in this case with elements cut into the rock rather than built up of quarried stone. And that is completely explicable by the fact that this structure was cut into a hillside, a rocky hillside, which had already been terraced in the area of a natural cave. And parts of this cave were, as seen on the left here, preserved to support the stairway, and on the right here, preserved to support the roof. Excuse me. Rock-cut structures have a very long lineage in the hills of Galilee, and indeed in Nazareth itself. And for an example, here we have a rock-cut building accessed through the doorway you see there, which was in use into the 20th century in central Nazareth, just a few streets away from this Roman period example. Now, whether any of the built elements of this building, this structure at the Sisters of Nazareth site, the one we've dated to the 1st century and associated with domestic material, still exist, is a very difficult question to answer. Elements of a 1st century wall may well exist within this much later Crusader period wall. There are elements that aren't explicable in terms of the Crusader date and are clearly earlier than the latest phase of the wall. But whatever interpretation you give to this specific wall and to other bits and pieces of walling that could or could not go with the structure at the Sisters of Nazareth, clearly this was a first century structure associated with domestic material. In short, it was, as it has become colloquially termed, a house. The interest for understanding Jesus's Nazareth, as it were, of finding a first century house at the Sisters of Nazareth is partly archaeological. Archaeologically, this is by far the best preserved first century domestic building we know of in central Nazareth, in the ancient settlement of Nazareth. It is also indicative of a way of life that is consistent with other archaeological evidence we can bring forward for first century Nazareth from the Church of the Annunciation site and from a rescue excavation conducted just a short way away by the Israel Antiquities Authority a few years after we began work on the Sisters of Nazareth site, which found another first century domestic building, another first century house. This one built away from the hill slope and so constructed out of quarried materials, apart from some rock cutting used in the base of walls. So not an entirely different construction technique, but one explicable in terms of the precise location of the structure. So in other words, we have now two quite consistently constructed houses with quite consistent arrays or ranges of objects associated with them from first century Nazareth to put alongside the agricultural installations and so forth found at the Church of the Annunciation site. But there is, of course, as some people watching this will know, a textual interest in the Sisters of Nazareth site. The church, built in the Byzantine period at the site, is very probably what modern scholars call the Church of the Nutrition, possibly the major pilgrimage church attested by texts that has been lost to scholarship from the 5th and 6th centuries. In other words, a major lost Byzantine pilgrimage church. Its size, compared to the Church of the Annunciation, suggests its importance. In Byzantine terms, the size and elaboration of a church usually indicates its status. And it's a much more elaborate building in many ways than the Church of the Annunciation structure, the Church of the Annunciation church of the same date. And this size and grandeur might indicate either or both of two things: that it was considered a more important religious site, or it was considered a much more important and administrative, so to speak, institutional building within the church in Nazareth. And my interpretation is that it was the cathedral of Byzantine Nazareth, the Orthodox cathedral. However, going back to that first interpretation, if the Church of the Annunciation was built on one of the holiest places in the Byzantine perception of the world, the Church of the Annunciation was built to commemorate the Annunciation by the angel to Mary of Christ's forthcoming birth. It begs the question of what was at the Sisters of Nazareth site. And this brings into focus a 7th century, just post-Byzantine pilgrimage account, part of a wider ranging pilgrimage text called De Locis Sanctis, written of all places on the Isle of Iona in Scotland, which seems to attest an eyewitness account in the late 7th century of a church which was almost certainly built in the Byzantine period, but was a grand church close to the Church of the Annunciation, which the Sisters of Nazareth Church was, where there was a crypt under a church, which there was at the Sisters of Nazareth site, where there was what at least seemed to the pilgrim like a spring, a well of running water, which was lifted up by pulleys. Well, there is evidence for that at the Sisters of Nazareth site in the Byzantine period, and in which, in the crypt, there were 2 tombs, between which was a house, presumably the ruins of a house, as it was in a crypt. And that house, the pilgrimage account says, was revered because that was where Jesus Christ was brought up by Joseph and Mary. My own position on the Sisters of Nazareth house is that it was the building, the ruin, believed by the Byzantines who built the church mentioned in De Locis Sanctis to be the house where Jesus had brought up. Whether they were correct in that belief, we have absolutely no way of knowing. Of course, it was a 1st century house, but maybe they just had a lucky guess, or maybe they knew something which we don't about that building. I don't think we can really say one way or the other. But what I can say is that all this archaeological evidence has a transformatory effect, if that's a word, on the understanding of the Nazareth Jesus grew up in and knew as a young adult. And that is what archaeology can do for our understanding of 1st century Nazareth in the early 21st century. Hopefully, in another 50 or 100 years, we'll be able to say a lot more from archaeological evidence. But we can already say far more from archaeology about 1st century Nazareth as a place than we can from any other source. And that's where I'll end it tonight. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much. Let me just show my video. Would you just show the pictures of your books? That would be really good.
These are the two formal archaeological reports of the Nazareth Archaeological Project. First one on the work in the valley and reassessing previous archaeological work inside Nazareth. The second on the Sisters of Nazareth convent, because these are rather heavy going for non-archaeologists. They are very technical reports. I've recently, as I said at the start, written Archaeology of Jesus' Nazareth, which combines evidence from both of those books and explains it to non-archaeologists, and hopefully makes it more intelligible to a reader without archaeological training. But also it draws attention more to the specifically first century elements of my work in Nazareth and around Nazareth, and draws attention to the implications of that work for understanding the Gospels and understanding the context of Jesus in Galilee.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Ken. We have a few questions coming in. If you want to post a question,
have any questions,
please post those in the chat. Someone says, thank you, Professor Dark. I have been told that there is another location in Nazareth that claims to be the childhood home of Jesus. Do you have any thoughts about that particular site and the claims about it being Mary's home?
Right. The site.
I wonder if that is the Annunciation site.
The site you're probably thinking of is within the Church of the Annunciation complex, but not under the Church of the Annunciation itself. It's a church rebuilt now out of a 12th century ruin called the Church of St. Joseph. And that was excavated by the Franciscans, who were responsible for the rescue excavations at the Church of the Annunciation. And that site, when excavated, was shown to have indeed some of those rock cut features also under the Church of the Annunciation underneath it, and that shows it probably first century, or at least Roman period, activity on that site. But unfortunately, we can't say it was the church referenced in De Locis Sanctis, simply because there wasn't a Byzantine church there, or for that matter, a 7th century church there, but there was a Byzantine period wine press there. So you're not going to have a church on the site of a wine press. It may have been a subsidiary element of the Church of the Annunciation complex. It could have been something else, but what it wasn't the church mentioned by De Locis Sanctis. And so that contender for the church referred to in De Locis Sanctis, I'm sorry to say, has to be discounted. And I'm not the first scholar to have discounted that as the De Locis Sanctis site. Another site which is claimed frequently to be the church mentioned in De Locis Sanctis is the Greek Orthodox Church of the Annunciation by St. Mary's Well. St. Mary's Well was a focus of early Roman activity, unfortunately, it probably wasn't part of the same settlement as Roman period Nazareth. It was referred to in a late Roman text as being outside Nazareth. And if you plot, as I've done, the finds of Roman period pottery in the Nazareth area, there's a cluster in the center of modern Nazareth, including the Church of the Annunciation site, the International Marian Center site, the Sisters of Nazareth site. And then there's a big gap, and then there's a cluster around St. Mary's Well, or Mary's Well, people also call it. Depends which terminology you use for it. So that was probably a settlement of that date, but it probably wasn't part of the settlement of Nazareth. And moreover, it's a long way from the Byzantine Church of the Annunciation, which De Locis Sanctis specifically says the church of the church built over the house of Jesus was near. So again, there doesn't seem to be a chance that that was the church built over the childhood home of Jesus, in the opinion of the Byzantines.
The same person, in fact, says that he, I won't read his name, but he says that he hopes to make his 4th stay with the sisters next month. And he speaks of visiting the 1st century home. So can I ask, if I or anyone here was to visit Nazareth and the convent of the Sisters of Nazareth, what can a visitor see of what you've shown us?
Well, a visitor can potentially see everything of what I've shown you, but at the Sisters of Nazareth site. But bear in mind that all of this is in a purpose-built underground space. The sisters call it a cellar, and they refer to the cellar, which I have to say, when I first went there, evoked a much smaller space than something extending under their garden, under one complete range of their convent, and then into the courtyard of their cloister. But it is quite difficult to get to see. It's only viewable by appointment for those who are not staying at the Sisters of Nazareth convent, and I don't think guests at the convent have an automatic right, in the opinion of the nuns, to see the cellar.
Yes.
I should think they are normally shown the cellar, but I've never stayed there myself.
Yes.
We, as a matter of sort of professional ethics and courtesy, we kept our team resident off-site. So we stayed in hotels and hostels elsewhere in Nazareth rather than using up the rooms at the convent. I'm sure they have happily given them to us, but we didn't think that was right.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question? This person says, absolutely correct. We have been granted permission each time, but we have to request to be shown the church and the home. Yes, it's not exactly a tourist site, I would imagine then.
No. I mean, pilgrimage groups do visit it. Some tour groups I've known visit it. Groups from places like St. George's College in Jerusalem, the Anglican College, regularly visit it. There seems to be a sort of special relationship between the Sisters of Nazareth and St. George's. But I don't think it would be perceived as a normal tourist site,
No, no.
even in the sense that something like the Nazareth village reconstruction and excavation would be on the tourist trail. I don't think there would be any capacity, possibly even wish for mass tourism.
No, of course not. Of course not. Of course not. I highly recommend the book that Professor Ken has shown you, and he goes into more detail naturally into what he's shown us today. But very enjoyable detail. Professor, I can't speak for his technical professional archaeology books, but the books I've read for an interested layperson, such as myself and many of us here, and many who will watch this video later, I highly recommend this book. It has lots of illustrations, photographs, diagrams and maps to help understand how the site is laid out. I highly recommend it, and I'm so grateful that Professor Ken has taken time to speak to us this evening about his work. Elizabeth Hess has her hand up. Oh, no, she's clapping her hands. There we are. So people are clapping their hands in appreciation, Professor Ken. Thank you so much for this. I will download the video and convert it, and then it will be made available later on. But I offer on behalf of everyone here and those who will watch the video later, our heartfelt thanks for you taking time out of your schedule to speak to us this evening. Thank you so much, Professor Ken.
Thank you very much for having me.